blistering wasteland of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath a sky that cracked with heat, one of Rome's most powerful men died a death so grotesque, it echoed across generations. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest Roman to ever live, a man who bought his empire piece by piece, exploiting fires, buying slaves, manipulating markets. Wealth wasn't just his power, it was his identity. But gold can't buy what the soul truly craves. Crassus ruled Rome with two legends, Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, warriors carved from marble and myth. Compared to them, Crassus was mocked, a banker wearing armor. He wasn't feared, he wasn't admired, he was tolerated. That humiliation festered, and Crassus, nearly 60, drowning in riches, couldn't stand it anymore. He didn't want peace. He wanted immortality. To him, the path was obvious: war. East of Rome lay Parthia, a kingdom overflowing with silk, spice, and unimaginable gold. If he could conquer it, he wouldn't just match Caesar's glories in Gaul. He'd eclipse them. He saw it all: the triumphs, the wealth, the legacy. But ambition, when left unchained, devours the man who holds the leash. The Senate said no. Too dangerous, too reckless. But Crassus marched anyway, into the desert, into legend, into ruin. This isn't a tale of strategy or politics. It's a warning about greed, hubris, and the cost of chasing something beyond reason. Because Crassus didn't just die. He was broken, betrayed, and burned by the very thing he worshipped. The gold that crowned his life became the fire that silenced him forever. Rome, 53 BCE. Its ambition burned hotter than its sun. Three men ruled the known world: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. Together, they formed the first triumvirate, an uneasy alliance of sword, strategy, and wealth. But behind closed doors, Crassus felt the imbalance. Pompey was the war hero, Caesar was the rising star, and Crassus? He was the banker, the man with gold, but no glory. That insult clung to him like a second skin. He watched Pompey dominate the Mediterranean, Caesar conquer Gaul. Their names rang through Senate halls like thunder. His, by contrast, barely stirred the air. His victories weren't sung by poets. They were written in account books, property deals, slave markets, influence bought, not earned. Rome admired strength, not spreadsheets. So Crassus made a choice, a desperate, dangerous one. If they were warriors, he would become a legend. He'd earn his legacy not through coins, but through conquest. He set his sights on Parthia, a kingdom glittering with unimaginable wealth. Spices, silk, silver, gold. A golden bridge between east and west. To Crassus, it wasn't just an empire. It was a mirror of everything he valued. And if he could take it, he would outshine them all. But the Senate, wary of his ambition, refused to authorize war. So Crassus didn't wait. In 55 BC, he arrived in Syria as governor. His mind was already at war. He began preparations immediately, brushing aside local commanders who warned him. Parthia is no ordinary kingdom. He didn't listen. Why would he? The East had fallen before Rome's discipline. Their roads, their fortresses, their legions. How could desert warriors hope to stand against that? Besides, his spies whispered of weakness, civil unrest in the Parthian court, a distracted king, vulnerable borders. To Crassus, it all added up to one thing: victory. He assembled a colossal invasion force, 7 legions, nearly 40,000 infantry, flanked by 4,000 cavalry, and thousands more light troops. One of Rome's largest eastern expeditions ever. And among them rode his son Publius Crassus, a rising star in his own right. Young, fierce, proven in Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. To Crassus, this was more than a war. It was the foundation of a dynasty, a family carved into history. In the spring of 53 BCE, they crossed the Euphrates. At first, all seemed perfect. Villages surrendered. Towns fell quickly. The desert stretched flat and empty, the perfect stage for Rome's might. But every step forward was a step into a trap. And the desert, it was not empty, it was waiting. The invasion began with the illusion of triumph. Crassus and his legions crossed the Euphrates at Zeugma. Town after town fell without resistance. The flat, open plains of Mesopotamia seemed made for Roman warfare. Siegecraft worked. Discipline held. The desert looked empty and vulnerable, just as he had imagined. But the emptiness was a lie. What Crassus saw as weakness was bait. General Surina, the commander of Parthia's forces, was young, but lethal. Instead of facing the Romans head-on, he lured them deeper. Every surrender was part of a trap. Every empty village was a step further from safety. The Romans believed they were marching to glory. In truth, they were being pulled into the desert's jaws. Parthian scouts appeared like ghosts, always watching, never engaging. At night, the Romans heard strange sounds in the dunes. Whispers, hooves, silence, and then nothing. It was warfare not of swords, but of nerves. Surina understood what Crassus did not. Victory didn't require a direct assault. It only required time, heat, fear. The Parthians were masters of mobility. Their cavalry could strike, vanish, and strike again before the Romans could react. They didn't need to win a battle. They needed to shatter discipline, one sleepless night at a time. The Roman formations, forged in forests and cities, began to crack under the sun. Heavy armor baked their skin. Sand filled their throats. Water became rationed. Supply lines vanished under constant attack. And yet Crassus kept going, convinced the enemy would eventually stand and fight. But the Parthians had no intention of playing by Roman rules. They didn't fight for terrain. They fought for psychological collapse. One moment, a convoy would be ambushed in broad daylight. The next, a detachment sent in pursuit would find nothing. Not a track, not a trail. Crassus began to doubt his maps, his scouts, even his own officers. Fatigue twisted everything. Suspicion spread. Whispers turned to arguments. Morale cracked. This wasn't a war. It was a haunting. The Romans had marched expecting glorious conquest. What they found was a shadow war. An enemy who struck like a whisper, then melted into the horizon. And now, days into the march, with supplies dwindling and no true battle in sight, a terrible thought crept into the minds of the legionaries. What if they never planned to fight us at all? Carrhae, a quiet city on the edge of northern Mesopotamia, was where Marcus Crassus decided to stop running from shadows. He would force the Parthians into a traditional battle that he believed was where Rome reigned supreme. The terrain seemed to favor him. Low hills offered defensive positions. A nearby water source promised relief. And intelligence reports whispered that Surina's army was finally near. Crassus felt vindicated. This would be the moment, his moment, to prove himself not just a financier, but a commander of legend. At dawn on June 9, 53 BCE, the Roman army took formation. 7 legions in tight formation. Heavy infantry in the center. Cavalry and light troops flanking the wings. Standards high. Shields locked. The machine of Roman conquest stood ready. Crassus took his place with the center. On the right, his son Publius commanded the cavalry. Then, across the horizon, the enemy emerged. But it wasn't what the Romans expected. There were no infantry lines. No siege weapons. No static formation. Instead, they saw something terrifying. A fluid, gleaming force of cavalry that moved like a single living organism. In the center, cataphracts, Parthian heavy cavalry, armored head to toe in shining metal scales. Around them, thousands of horse archers, circling like vultures. And then the sky darkened. The battle began not with a charge, but with a storm of arrows. Endless, precision-guided, relentless. Roman shields, built for spears and swords, broke under the downpour. The noise of iron on iron, screams, and confusion echoed across the flat earth. For hours, the bombardment didn't stop. The Parthians had brought supply trains loaded with fresh arrows. Their archers never ran dry. The Romans, pinned, could do nothing but endure. And then came the fatal decision. Publius, young, brave, and burning to prove himself, led a cavalry charge into the Parthian center, hoping to shatter their formation. It was exactly what Surinna wanted. The cataphracts absorbed the charge. Then the horse archers encircled. Publius and his men were cut off, isolated, shredded. The dust turned red. One by one they fell, arrows finding flesh with surgical cruelty. In the distance, Crassus watched helplessly. And then, the final blow. Parthian soldiers raised a head on a spear. His sons. Publius, the legacy Crassus hoped to pass on, was gone. His face now a grotesque trophy paraded before Roman lines. Something shattered in Crassus. Not just grief, but clarity. He was no longer leading a campaign. He was leading a funeral. The discipline of Rome, the pride of the legions, began to fracture. Thirst, fear, despair, confusion. No way forward, no way back. The desert, once a stage for glory, had become a tomb, and Crassus had no plan. The death of Publius Crassus didn't just wound the Roman army. It shattered its soul. From the moment his son's head was raised high on a Parthian spear, Marcus Crassus was no longer a general. He was a grieving father, hollowed out by failure. The man who had marched across the Euphrates with dreams of immortality now stood paralyzed, broken by grief, deafened by the weight of his own ambition. And the Parthians weren't finished. They didn't need to charge. They didn't need to storm the Roman lines. They let fear do the work. Every whisper in the desert wind became an omen. Every shifting shadow a threat. Discipline, the iron core of Roman power, began to rot from within. The legions, battered and dehydrated, were trapped in the open, surrounded by enemies who moved faster, struck smarter, and vanished before they could be caught. Water was nearly gone. The wounded moaned through the night. Dead bodies festered in the sun. And the generals argued. Crassus, once full of defiance, now issued confused and panicked orders. Some officers demanded a final stand. Others pleaded for retreat. But there was no plan, no leadership, only fear. As night fell, Crassus made his choice. Retreat to Carrhae, a nearby city with walls, water, and the faint hope of survival. Maybe the terrain would limit Parthian cavalry. Maybe the army could regroup. It was a desperate move, and it came far too late. The retreat began under cover of darkness. A long, silent column of exhausted soldiers abandoning the battlefield. But silence couldn't hide the truth. The Roman army was breaking apart. Discipline gave way to chaos. Formation gave way to panic. Some dropped their weapons, others their shields. Many simply collapsed into the dust, never to rise again. The Parthians struck like shadows. One by one, the rear guard fell, then the flanks, then the middle. Screams echoed across the sands. Horses buckled. Men vanished in the dark. By dawn, the army that had crossed the Euphrates, proud and invincible, had become a scattering of survivors limping into Carrhae, their standards gone, their honor gutted. Inside the city there was no safety, no celebration, only silence. Crassus had reached the end, not just of the campaign but of the illusion, the dream of glory, the fantasy of conquest. It was gone. His son was dead, his army humiliated. And in his heart he must have known there would be no return to Rome. Dawn broke over Carrhae with a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Crassus, now a man hollowed by loss and failure, faced a decision he never imagined. Surrender or die alone in the dust. His legions were shattered, his officers defeated. His own soul was drowning in grief. Then came the offer. A message arrived under the white flag of truce. The Parthian general, Surinna, proposed negotiations. A peaceful parley to discuss terms for withdrawal. No more blood, no more death, just a way out. A way to save what remained, To Crassus, it felt like a hand reaching through the darkness. His officers were divided. Some warned him, "This smells like a trap." Others begged him, "Please end this nightmare." And Crassus, desperate for anything that might redeem the wreckage of his legacy, agreed. A meeting was arranged. On a stretch of flat earth between the two armies, Crassus arrived with a small entourage of surviving commanders. No armor, no weapons, just hope and exhaustion. Surina met him there, tall, composed, and dressed in regal finery. But behind his courteous smile lay cold calculation. What happened next is still debated by historians. Some say the talks broke down. Others claim it was a setup from the start. But the result was the same. Violence erupted. Crassus and his men were overwhelmed. Some were cut down, others captured. And Marcus Licinius Crassus, once the richest man in Rome, was taken alive. But the Parthians weren't interested in ransoms or diplomacy. They wanted a message. To them, Crassus wasn't just a general. He was the embodiment of Roman arrogance, a man who invaded without cause, driven not by justice, but by greed. And they would make his death reflect that. Surina ordered an execution unlike any Rome had ever witnessed. Before an audience of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers, Crassus was dragged to his knees. Soldiers held his arms. Another forced open his mouth. His pleas, if any were spoken, were lost in the wind. Then the final insult, a crucible of molten gold, glowing like the sun, was brought forward. The metal that had defined Crassus's life now flowed like liquid fire. Slowly, deliberately, it was poured down his throat. The gold scorched through flesh, through bone, through everything. He remained conscious just long enough to understand. The man who once worshipped wealth above all else was now being devoured by it. It wasn't just a death. It was a statement to Rome, to history, to anyone who dared mistake greed for greatness. And in that final golden silence, the desert swallowed a king. The execution of Marcus Crassus didn't end with the pouring of gold. It began there. Within weeks, the news reached Rome, and the city shook. This wasn't just the death of a man. It was the death of a myth. The myth of Roman invincibility, the illusion that wealth and might were always enough. Crassus had crossed the Euphrates chasing glory, and returned in pieces as a symbol of failure, of arrogance, of what happens when ambition loses touch with reality. In the Senate, panic spread like wildfire. The triumvirate, once Rome's unshakable triangle of power, collapsed overnight. Without Crassus to balance the ambitions of Pompey and Caesar, alliance turned to rivalry, suspicion, and then civil war. The Republic would never recover. But the Parthians weren't finished. Crassus's severed head, and possibly his hand, were sent east, to the court of King Oroda II. Not buried, not mourned, but displayed. Some say it was even used as a prop in Parthian theater. Held aloft during performances of Euripides' Bacchae, where Crassus played the role of a doomed king destroyed by his own delusions. The message was crystal clear. Let this be Rome's warning. Your wealth means nothing here. But the cruelty of his death masked something more complex. Surviving Roman prisoners weren't all executed. Some were spared, settled in remote parts of the empire, allowed to live, farm, even raise families. They became living contrasts to Crassus, men who surrendered and survived. The gold execution wasn't mere sadism. It was calculated symbolism. Crassus had invaded not out of duty, but greed. He saw Parthia as a treasury to be looted. And in the end, the treasure turned on him. The molten gold that filled his mouth wasn't just metal. It was judgment. The thing he loved most weaponized. In time, his story became legend. Writers, philosophers, and emperors would revisit it for generations. Plutarch turned it into moral tragedy. Historians debated whether the molten gold was literal or poetic, but all agreed on one truth. Crassus died not from a wound, but from a flaw. He mistook ambition for destiny. He mistook wealth for wisdom, and in doing so, he gave the world a final, unforgettable lesson. The things we worship most can become the instruments of our destruction.